Good morning and welcome to IDC's webinar titled IDC Latin America Digital Economy from Crisis to Opportunity. This webinar is designed to provide you with a view of new opportunities for Latin American organizations with digitally enhanced products, services, and experiences. My name is Irina Zvagelski and I am the IDC Latin America Regional Account Manager, and I will be serving as your moderator today. First, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Please know that throughout the session you will be able to ask questions from your computers. To do so at any point, please type your question into the Q&A box. These questions will be answered at the end of the presentation by the presenter or via email if additional analyst input is needed and we don't have enough time. Please also note that within a few days you will also receive an email with the link of the audio replay of this webinar. You can share this with colleagues internally. Today, you will be hearing a presentation from Jay Gambiner. Jay Gambiner is our VP of Research for IDC Latin America. He manages teams of hardware, software, and services analysts who are spread out throughout the region, providing quarterly and semi-annual analysis across nearly 20 countries in Latin America. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Jay. Thank you.
Thanks, Irina, and thanks to everybody for taking half an hour out of your time today to learn more about what we're seeing in Latin America. It's definitely been an interesting ride so far this year after a pretty challenging year last year. So we're seeing a lot of interesting trends and hoping to share some of those with you. So for those of you that aren't familiar with IDC, IDC is a global multinational firm. We have 1,100 analysts spread out across over 50 countries in the world. Within Latin America, we have nearly 90 analysts spread out through the region. Hold on. There we go. Sorry about that. And it's interesting to note that nearly half of the analysts for Latin America are based, half the analysts for IDC are based in emerging markets regions. So one of the differentiators we have is many analysts based in the countries that we're doing research on. We're not doing a lot of the research modeled from a central headquarters. We actually have local offices in those countries. So looking at some of this country coverage that we have, so we have offices in Latin America in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela. And we also have teams of analysts that go out every 90 days to other markets in Central America, the Caribbean, and also South America. Some of the ones you're probably more familiar with, like Costa Rica, Panama, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ecuador. And one of the new areas we've been investing in over the last year is some of the smaller markets in South America, which later on I'll show you why we've been investing in those in addition to the requests from our clients. So we're now doing research every 90 days in countries like Bolivia, instead of Panama, that should say Paraguay, and Uruguay. So those are 3 countries that we just added recently this past year. So if you'd like any information on Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay, we now have a lot more information on those. So some of you, I'm not sure how what your interaction with IDC has been up until now, but a lot of you probably know IDC for our trackers. So the trackers are kind of like a syndicated research that's published every either 90 days, 180 days, or once a year. But IDC does a lot more than just trackers. We have consulting services, which are highly customized, strategic answers to many of your questions for new market entry, looking at competition and other things, as well as providing content and branding for your services. So providing speakers, providing content for digital marketing campaigns, and many other things. And when we're done, you already met Irina at the start. You can contact her and she'll be happy to share lots of the additional things we can do for your companies. So with that, let's start and talk about what we're seeing in the region. So 2017 is definitely a transition year. Here you can see the pretty recent information from different government agencies, the World Bank, and also the IMF, with GDP growth and how it's changed from 2016, how 2016 was, what they're forecasting for 2017 as well as 2018. So you could see some big differences in some of the countries. I mean, Argentina, you could see going from negative to positive, so more than 2% negative, now going to nearly 3% positive. That's a huge increase. And the big one that's really affecting lots of the regional numbers. I mean, when you see regional numbers for Latin America, you have to remember that over 40% of the numbers usually weighted by Brazil. And you can see with Brazil being over 3% negative, that was essentially pulling down lots of the regional averages. So Brazil, luckily, or not luckily, but fortunately, according to the economists, is going to be much better than it was last year. And you can see they are predicting a slightly positive growth in the market. Chile and Colombia, also more positive than we saw last year. Ecuador, even though you don't see a line there, it's actually at 0. So that's actually an improvement over past year. Mexico and Peru are the two where we're seeing years probably slightly less than last year. Mexico for sure. Peru, you can see the difference isn't that great, but it's still quite positive, over 3%. And Peru has been consistently growing 3 to 4% nearly over the last decade. So it continues to be one of those countries that many vendors are betting on for the long term. And then rest of Latin America, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Venezuela, this is as of February, was negative 5.5%. It wouldn't surprise me. And what we've seen with Venezuela over the past few years is that at the start of the year, the economists are fairly optimistic, and then as the year goes through and reforms don't happen and the price of oil continues to stay low and there's changes to the Constitution and fighting in the streets, that number continues to become more and more negative over time. So I'd say that negative 5.5% for this year is probably highly optimistic. So if we look at, we know that IT growth is pretty closely correlated to some of the trends that you see in the overall economy. When the overall economy start growing faster, generally consumers and businesses will also start spending more, and it often translates into additional hardware, software, and services purchases. So here you can see the Argentina and Venezuela numbers are just written there because it was off the scale. But the important number to focus here on is the light blue one, which is the 2017 IT growth. So you can see for total Latin America, we're looking at about 2.5% with our most updated numbers. These are actually prelim numbers. They haven't been published officially by IDC yet, but we will be publishing them within a few weeks. So it will be less than 3% this year for a total value of about $96 billion spent on hardware, software, and services. And each of those numbers that you can see in billions, and each of you will get a copy of a recording of this as well as a copy of the slides. Those numbers are the total numbers spent in hardware, software, services in Latin America. This does not include telecom services, so things like phone bills or internet bills are not included in this number here. But overall, you can see, a slight decrease from last year. Now, you have to remember that this is also influenced by the exchange rate. So in some countries, you'll see, strong growth in Venezuela, for example. It looks like over 9%, but a lot of this is also impacted by differences in exchange rates because this is looking at a constant currency. So if we look at, within that, high 2% growth, what's growing and what's shrinking? Because imagine many of you on the phones are saying, okay, well, which kind of company should we be partnering with? Where's the opportunities for growth? So what you can see here is the total IT spending of 2017 matches that previous number I said of $96 billion. And what you could see is if you start at the infrastructure as a service up at the top at about 12 o'clock and then go to the right, you can see the relative growth rates and as they go down. So if you could see, even though the cloud platform, the cloud of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, even though it still only represents less than 3% of total IT spending in the region, you could see, those are growing at strong rates, growing, 15%, over 20%, as you can see from the colors. Now, if you go to the next one, the mid-range servers, outsourcing, project-oriented. You can see those are growing 5 to 10%. The ones in purple on the bottom, pretty low growth, low single digits. And then you could see on the upper left-hand side, we could say between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock, those are all red, which means they are not growing. Those are actually shrinking in total spending in Latin America. And if you kind of take a step back and say, okay, what do some of these have in common? You can see the fast-growing ones up at, 1 o'clock, the infrastructure as a service, platform, and software, those are cloud. And, almost exclusively on the upper left-hand side, the ones that are not growing are pretty concentrated in hardware. So you have, low-end servers, tablets, high-end servers, printers, PCs, PC monitors, and feature phones. You can see smartphones, which is now 34% of all spending in the region. That is growing, but in single digits. It's not like in the previous years where some years we had high double digits, even triple digits. Kind of like the migration in Latin America has, in most countries, already happened. So there's not a huge customer base of people switching from feature phones to smartphones. So we're now looking at single-digit growth in a market that just a few years ago was showing high double-digit growth. So I'd mentioned previously, why is IDC investing in some of these other smaller markets? You would think, why are clients asking us for information on countries like Uruguay or Paraguay or Bolivia? So this is the reason. So if you compare this to the slide I showed a few minutes ago, looking, at the total region of, averaging between, let's say, 1% and 3% on the high cases, you could see these are countries in Latin America that are growing significantly higher than that. They have been growing significantly higher than that, and you can see the forecasts are that they will continue to be growing above 3%. So you can see most of these are concentrated in Central America and the Caribbean, with a few outliers such as Bolivia and Paraguay in South America. But you can see in a lot of these countries, where I said, for example, many of the countries, we don't really have a base of customers to switch from feature phones to smartphones. In some of these countries, like Bolivia, for example, you still have an important sizable part of the market where, the hardware markets are still growing in some cases, because you have families buying their first PCs, and as a result also still buying their first inkjet or laser printer for the home, or switching to smartphones. So in many of these countries, in some of them, they're less developed. So we're still kind of having the, IDC talks a lot about the, first and second and now third platform of technology. Many of these countries, have consumers and companies that are still investing in, second platform technologies, servers, basic networking equipment, PCs, mobile phones, et cetera. So, it's a great opportunity for vendors that are looking for, where is there still growth? If I'm still in this kind of like low-end margin hardware business, for example, which are the countries I should be including? Well, you should not forget about some of these smaller markets that are still growing quite fast. So now the challenge with those smaller markets is, how can you capitalize on it? In many cases, they're very small. In some cases, they're geographically disparate, especially if we're talking about things like islands, where you're talking about literally water separating them and you have to get from one island to the other. So if you're in the hardware business, it usually doesn't make sense for you to necessarily set up operations in each of these smaller countries. So there are large regional distributors, primarily based in Miami, but you have them located throughout the United States, but primarily here in Miami, which do have coverage in these countries. So, are you aligned with the correct distributors? What are you trying to look for when you're are you looking for a distributor that's more like a box mover? Are you looking for one that's more looking for value add? Are you looking for somebody that's more focused on networking or system integration? And IDC, we work with clients a lot and can help customers and new companies look at, who should they be partnering with when they're going into these new markets. Now, if you're in the software services business, sometimes it's a direct channel, especially if it's cloud. In many cases, you might not even need a local office to sell into these countries. Some cases, it's nothing more than just a credit card account. But many of you companies in the software or services business do need some local integrators or local partners to help you with. So are you aligning with the correct ones? Are the ones that you're with really the ones that you should be with? So anyway, please contact IDC if you'd like more information on that and how we might be able to help you. So I talked about this third platform, made up of important investments in technologies such as cloud, big data, social, and mobility. And what we're seeing is that those four items, together with some other accelerators, are really forming the basis for a digital transformation for the industry as well as many of your clients. And you can see here, IDC Latin America is predicting that by 2020, 40% of the top 3,000 companies are going to see the majority of their business depend on this ability to be able to create solutions that are focusing on how to reinvent your customer's business. In order to do that, you kind of need three very specific things. One is a digital transformation roadmap, which essentially helps put together a framework of how do I go from a company that is just kind of like exploring this new digital landscape to really becoming an innovator and companies actually coming to us for solutions. So rather than being reactive and going to customers when they're saying, I need somebody to help me with this, what we're seeing is the most advanced and forward-thinking companies already have solutions and use cases in place, and they're able to go to their customers and say, hey, Mr. largest pasta vendor in Chile, how are you going to go about and transform your customer experience or how suppliers purchase from you? Because there's not really any area of the companies that cannot be transformed from this digital transformation. As such, it involves lots of people and lots of lines of businesses within your customer base. So while in the past maybe IT companies were fairly complacent in only having to talk to the IT managers or the CIOs, what we're seeing now is many of these digital transformation processes are so transformative that, and so in some cases they can be expensive also. So you need to have the buy-in from multiple departments. So we're talking about, the finance department, talking to HR, talking to the marketing department. Each of these are areas that can be transformed from this digital transformation. And then ultimately, how do you go to market and show that you have the capabilities, and really focusing on things like process, the platforms, do you have the governance in place, and ultimately, do you have the talent? What we're seeing in Latin America in recent studies is in many cases there is a talent gap. It's not just a Latin America phenomenon. We actually see this throughout the world. IDC has done research not only in Latin America but also globally on this talent or skills gap, and it's a global phenomenon. So looking specifically at what companies are telling us here in Latin America, this is some preliminary results from a recent survey we did. This was 350 buyers in companies with more than 100 employees. So this is looking from IT and also the lines of business executives from these medium and large companies, looking at how familiar and how aggressive they are in using these different concepts or solutions. And you could see, there's still huge opportunity in Latin America. Some that globally gets a lot of play, like big data and analytics. You could see, 60% know about it, not using it. Another one, Internet of Things, IoT, half the sample saying they know it but not using it. But I mean, I think the positive news also is looking in the darker gray, cloud computing, social, as well as enterprise mobility. Over 6 out of 10 of these companies saying that they're familiar with the concepts and they are actively using it. Now, looking at the third platform, I mentioned that the third platform was, mobility, big data, cloud, and social, but we also have many innovation accelerators that come about as a result of those. So we have additional things like Internet of Things, robotics, 3D printing, cognitive and artificial intelligence, next generation security, and augmented and virtual reality. Some of these we'll talk about briefly here in this presentation today, but here you can see some of the numbers just for the Americas in what was spent last year on these technologies. So we're talking about tens of billions of dollars in these. And, you know, even though many companies might think, oh, well, I don't really have a use for cognitive systems or artificial intelligence. I mean, we're seeing lots and lots of different companies in Latin America that, you know, they sometimes don't associate themselves with these solutions, but then when you get down to it and say, okay, you have a call center based in Costa Rica, and right now they're all taking these calls. What if you were to use a chat bot to help with some of the most basic requests you're getting? And they say, oh yeah, actually that would work. So a lot of times when you see these, they seem very far out and kind of far-fetched and very futuristic, but when you bring it down to a use case and an ROI example, we're seeing lots of vendors in Latin America saying, hey, yeah, that makes sense, and starting to invest in these. And what we can see is these innovation accelerators and this digital transformation is really disrupting all industry. There's no industry that's not being disrupted by that. So here's just some examples, you know, going from retail to health to energy, finance, manufacturing, government, you know, all the different types of solutions that are being created with this digital transformation going on in the background. And here's just, you know, some specific use cases that we're seeing, both in Latin America and globally. But one of the keys, what we found for companies that are trying to get or grow in Latin America is a lot of times using an example from, you know, what might have been done in Berlin or Tokyo or New York really is not as impactful as going into Latin America and saying, look, here's something that's been done, you know, in Sao Paulo, or here's something that's been done in Medellin or in Santiago or whatnot. So having local customized content with real use cases specific to the region is usually much more powerful and compelling message. And this slide is not, I want to specify, it's not Latin America specific. This is globally. But it's interesting when you look at, you know, among the software and services companies, you know, where are the startups, which kinds of startups are getting funding? So here you can see, you know, just over the previous year, from Q4 of 2015 to Q4 of 2016, you know, how much is being funded, and you can see kind of like where the hot topics are. So you can see, you know, BI and analytics, nearly $4 billion, over 700 deals. Accounting and finance in Latin America, we've been seeing some companies in the cloud space, specifically in accounting and finance. Payments is also an area where we've seen a lot of interesting movement in Latin America, as well as supply chain and logistics. Latin America, in some of the countries, the infrastructure for moving product is not as efficient as it should be. So we are seeing a lot of movement and interest in solutions, technological solutions to help with supply chain and logistics in Latin America. So one of the things you saw at the start was, you know, which are the companies that are growing? It's really the, you know, the software and the services companies what we're seeing, and we're seeing companies really trying to transform themselves many ways. And how can I become a services company? We're even seeing many hardware companies kind of trying to de-emphasize their hardware part and look, you know, how can we turn ourselves into a solutions company? How can we go to a subscription model? So what we're seeing is, you know, that all these companies are looking at how they can transform their businesses. And one of the interesting things, number 3 here, is the industry cloud platform. So these are, you could think of these as kind of B2B cloud platforms. So this could be like a John Deere would be an example, or a General Electric, or companies of that size where they are actually putting together industry clouds. So these are clouds where they're managing it themselves, and also their clients connecting to that cloud. And as you can imagine, it produces an incredible amount of information that the companies can then use themselves to better service their clients. So this is an interesting slide, which I found, which is not specific to Latin America, but it looks at the different dynamics between the traditional, since we've been talking about cloud, between the traditional packaged software market as well as the cloud market. And what you see is, if you look at the light brownish, orangish, beige, it's interesting looking at that long tail. So what we see, and I can see from the names from some of you guys connecting here, some of you guys are smaller software companies. And it's interesting, you can see within that long tail of this is just as-a-service vendors, IDC has identified over 11,000 companies just in that as-a-service space within software. So that long tail is, pretty significant. That's representing nearly 60% of the entire cloud software market. So even though, and here you can see some of the larger well-known companies, even though they are larger and well-known, there's plenty of opportunity for many of these smaller companies to be successful in a region like Latin America. It's also interesting to look that even in the traditional package software space, over 22,000 software vendors in the market that IDC is aware of. All right. So when we talk about the digital transformation in Latin America, we see there's kind of 5 steps, with the first one being more ad hoc, where it's more like the digital resistor. We could say this would be the company that is approached by a client, the client tells them what they need, and the company, we could say begrudgingly or almost is pushed into offering a solution that the client's asking for, and then kind of progressing up this path where being more opportunistic, where you're actually going out and talking to the clients about how they can transform their business, then looking at how can we make this repeatable, scalable, and then finally, how can we really transform an industry or transform our customers' industry and be a disruptor in the best cases. And when we look at where do companies within Latin America fall across the spectrum, this is from a recent survey we did with some preliminary numbers. You can see almost 200 companies with more than 500 employees. So we're looking at some of the larger companies in Latin America. And the good news is, while over the past few years we saw the digital resistor number much higher, what we've seen is over the last year, we've been seeing the market starting to shift up that pyramid. So you could see that, nearly 70% is now in this digital explorer or digital player part of it. And the great news is 22%, and what we did was we kind of asked them different questions to help them get categorized, whether they're a digital transformer or digital player, are kind of self-identifying as digital transformer, which I tend to believe some of the companies might be slightly optimistic in their self-categorization, but we have seen this shifting up the pyramid, so I think the trend is positive. And as I had mentioned earlier, these transformations are so impactful to all the different lines of business within a company, and it's important when you're going out and selling to the, no matter what your solution is, you're probably going to have to talk to multiple departments, probably the finance department, definitely the IT department, maybe the marketing department, but obviously the needs and the, what each of these C-level folks is graded on internally, or how they, can justify their business or their salary or their bonus, it changes a lot. So you could see the, the CFO is concerned about optimizing plan, their budget, talking about cash flow, while the marketing person is trying to increase revenue, reduce the costs on the reduce the costs on marketing to bring in additional revenue, while the CIO is more looking at productivity, business processes, et cetera. And it's interesting when you look and see, when we asked how critical is technology, if we had asked this 15 years ago, I would probably assume, HR would probably be in the low single digits or maybe 0. You can see even 50% of the chief human resources officers we talked to are saying that technology is now critical for my line of business. And that was actually at the low end. You could see with the other ones is significantly more. So there's no department that's not impacted. So when you're creating a go-to-market solution for whatever the technology is, remember that you're probably not just going to be talking to the one traditional department you've been talking to, and you're going to be talking to multiple lines of business. and your marketing and messaging sometimes needs to change. What excites a CIO, maybe talking about the speeds and how fast you can replicate a database or how long the latency is for a cloud connection, is probably totally irrelevant to the CFO, for example. So sometimes you might need multiple marketing messages to really be most effective. Oh, here's one more additional data point, that 40% of all the IT projects were funded with line of business budgets in 2016, but by 2019, we expect that to be over 50%. So in terms of what are some of the up and coming and more far out technologies that we're seeing that could potentially transform us in Latin America. So one is the space of commercial virtual reality. So just to be clear, the difference between virtual reality and augmented reality. Virtual reality is when your eyes are completely covered. You cannot see anything beyond the viewers, like you see here in the picture. So it's like if you turned off the screen, everything would be black. Whereas augmented reality is when you're looking and you're actually seeing things in front of you, and there's actually digitally things superimposed on the screen. So for those of you with any kids, that would be like Pokemon Go would be augmented reality, not virtual reality. So here you could see some of our forecasts within Latin America by 2020. So you could see in the case of retail, over 200 million being spent on commercial virtual reality solutions. And we are seeing some examples already in the virtual reality space, some of them somewhat innovative in Latin America. Example would be the Six Flags in Mexico. They now have, as if you weren't, for those of you that don't like roller coasters, if it wasn't bad enough already, now they actually put on a virtual reality headset while you're on the roller coaster to actually make it seem even more terrifying than it is. There's company MUV, M-U-V, in Mexico that works with Fox. They've been working on interesting virtual reality solutions. In Chile, we have real estate companies like Phenoma that have been putting solutions for looking at real estate listings through virtual reality goggles, for example. But IDC believes that even though virtual reality is interesting, and you could see that there, we have over 200 million in some of these specific verticals being spent on that in Latin America, the more interesting one and the one where the monies are going to be much larger and spending is going to be greater is in the augmented reality. So this is the one I mentioned, which is more kind of like a Pokemon Go, where you're looking at something, you could see your hands, for example, but then you would also see other things superimposed on it. And here you can see some of the spending, and you'll notice that the revenues are much greater. So by 2020, we believe just in Latin America, they'll probably be spent nearly $1.5 billion across Latin America with AR, augmented reality spending solutions. And we're seeing a lot of app developers in the region and globally looking at, and also large companies looking at, how can they change their processes for, research and development, for service and maintenance, within healthcare, of how can we use augmented reality to help us. On the consumer side, we also see more playful things in Peru. There's Odyssey Park and Mega Plaza for the kids to kind of have an augmented reality experience. And we see interesting players, interesting vendors like Inmersis in Mexico, which are putting together solutions for customers both on the virtual reality side and the augmented reality side. Now, it's not that easy to do augmented reality, but the payback is huge. But you can imagine, sending out a repairman to a elevator shaft to get repaired, where maybe he's fairly new and he or she isn't really sure, which button they should be pushing or how they could go about. I mean, you could essentially have an expert in Japan talking to, the Fujitec elevator company in Chile and guide him through what he should be doing to fix a solution. One of the things that, the industry is looking forward to is 5G. So right now, 5G doesn't exist anywhere in the world, but within a few years, they're going to start with trials, isolated trials. And because augmented reality does use a lot of bandwidth and it uses a lot of power and computing power. So once we have 5G connections, that's going to be one of those hurdles that we'll be able to cross. Now in Latin America, we also have a lot of local manufacturers for cars. And there's been a lot of talk about, the self-driving cars, the autonomous cars. So for those of you that are not familiar with the different categorizations of self-driving cars, this is not an IDC, these levels are not IDC, it's not an IDC terminology. This is kind of like industry standard terminology. So level 1 is essentially what most of us drive today. This is where, you might have an adaptive cruise control where if you're on cruise control and somebody hits the brakes in front of you, that maybe it, alerts you or slows down. But essentially the driver always has to have their hands on the wheel, or they should be having the hands on the wheel at some time. Then level 2 is where we're seeing most of the cars today, which is, hands off. This is where an automated system could take full control of the vehicle in terms of accelerating or braking or steering, but the driver is supposed to be, paying attention and be prepared to immediately grab the steering wheel. And right now we're kind of at this transition point where we're going to start seeing a lot more cars move from level 2 to level 3. So level 3 is considered like eyes off. This is where the driver can really safely turn their attention away from driving. Maybe they could do texting or even watch a movie. The vehicle should be able to handle, emergency braking, but in some cases, the driver might need to be called upon to do something in case of an emergency. And then level 4 is a little further out. Level 4 would be, the driver can be doing something else, but the difference is the person sitting in the car really doesn't need to do anything. They wouldn't really need to handle the car, but the car can park itself and the driver really doesn't need to take control. And level 5 is more, no human intervention. It'd almost be like a robot-like taxi. They might not even have a steering wheel in the car, which is probably many years off. But you can see that all the different vendors are kind of positioning. We've been seeing interesting venture capital going into this space. We've been seeing the larger players like GM and Ford getting into this space, buying up companies, looking at the technologies, even companies like Uber, talking about self-driving trucks and whatnot. So even though we currently are not seeing a lot of these in Latin America, we know that over time this is going to happen, especially as Latin America does produce a lot of cars. So maybe in the beginning, Latin America might not be a consumer as much for some of these cars, but they might be producing them for some of the markets around the world. One of the other areas where we've been seeing a lot of interest in Latin America is Internet of Things, or IoT. And one of the opportunities for IoT is it involves so many different parts. You have the hardware part, the software part, connectivity, services, that there's kind of room for everybody to play. And you can see in order to really have a great IoT solution, you really need to have all these different components layered. So there's places for the security guys to get involved. There's places for the sensor guys. There's places for the telecom operators to get involved. So that's one of the reasons why we've been seeing in Latin America a lot of interest in the IoT space. And what we're seeing is that, all the industries kind of have their own use cases. So here you could see IDC's identified, 20 or 30 here of some of the more well-known use cases across the different verticals. But it's interesting, when we look in Latin America, we actually see it much more concentrated. So within Latin America, these 10 use cases here, which make up 6 different industries, we believe that represents about 83% of all the spending, or I should say over 80% of all the spending for IoT in Latin America. And what you'll notice is, a lot of it's focused on, manufacturing and transportation. So those are some of the the bigger ones, as well as smart grids. And speaking of smart grids, we're actually seeing a lot of interest in different smart city initiatives across Latin America. And when we say smart city, it's kind of a pretty general term, but you can see there's so many different areas that can be part, or different components that can be part of what we might call a smart city. You know, you have waste and water, you could have, you know, education and healthcare, or, you know, some of the more well-known ones in Latin America would be around public safety, citizen, and waste and water up till now. And we could see that it's been growing. So, you know, Medellin, Brazil, we have example. Even some of the smaller countries we've been seeing have been actively participating in, you know, traveling around the world, looking at other smart, visiting Barcelona, which is one of kind of like considered one of the more premier smart cities in the world, or going to Dubai, which is another one, and learning from, you know, the mayors, Latin American mayors or governors going to those countries and learning about how those countries have been doing it. And here's some specific examples in Latin America as well in terms of connected production lines in Mexico and some of the benefits, or, you know, optimizing logistics or putting sensors on buses so that you know where the bus is and when it's gonna arrive, as well as looking at redoing the electrical grids in places like Brazil. So we kind of talked about some of these opportunities, but, you know, how can I reach some of these new customers? So what we're seeing is that the customer journey is actually changing quite a bit. This is not just something in Latin America, it's something that it's really changing the industry as a whole. And there's really 6 kind of stages for this. You know, and 3 of them, explore, evaluate, and purchase, are more the cognitive steps that a buyer takes to acquire a product or services. And IDC thinks of those 3 more as like the creation loop. And then the other 3 are more on the post-sale stages where, you know, you're looking at being an advocate or renewing or expanding. So it's kind of this great loyalty loop where kind of one feeds into the other, and as more of the services are being sold as a service or AAS, we see that, you know, this kind of cloud model or as a service model becomes more important. And it's also interesting to see when we look at the different partners in Latin America and the channel partners and who your partners might be, is looking at the profit margins and why they're going towards services. So this is just looking at a global level in terms of some of the average profit margins. So it's pretty apparent looking at why are the, you know, why does nobody want to call themselves a box mover anymore? Well, you could see reselling hardware and software, it's really only on average. Once you get into the, you know, professional services or managed services, then you're talking about mid to high double-digit profit margin. So it's, you know, it's almost a factor, you know, logarithmic, I don't know what that word is, an important increase in the margins. So that's what we're also seeing a shift. So, you know, if you're saying, you know, I'm a partner now, or who are my channel partners now? What am I looking for 5 years from now? We can see that there's a, you know, a big difference in what we're looking for. While in the past, when selling second platform technologies, we were looking for more broad, kind of a one-stop, one-shop fits all, one-stop fits all solution, where in the future we can see as it becomes much more sophisticated, clients are really going to be needing specialized solutions, not necessarily so broad. Also, while when you're dealing with hardware in the past, it was more kind of like a short-term transactional deal. What we're seeing is that as we look out towards the future, it's going to be more long-term, more relationship-based, and more of a collaboration with the partners. Where in the past, you know, once I received a server or a laptop, a lot of times it could, you know, my IT department alone could probably configure it, whereas the solutions now are becoming much more advanced, and in many cases it might be an issue of code. You know, when we look at things like software-defined networking or software-defined applications, as things go to more code-based changes as opposed to physical switches. You might not have the employees prepared to be making changes to codes. As such, you need to be looking for the correct partners for collaborating. And we're also seeing that the partner ecosystem is really going to be changing. And so we believe that we're going to see a big shakeup in terms of the types of partners, not only in Latin America, but globally in the coming years. So we're going to, and we've already started to see this in Latin America where, some of the partners have disappeared from the market, some of the partners have been absorbed, and others have been transforming their business in terms of their go-to-market or their solutions or trying to add more value as opposed to just dropping something off and coming back in a year or 3 years and saying, will you renew this contract for me? So in terms of wrapping up, since I'm a little over on time here, just to summarize for Latin America, in 2017, we are seeing, overall, it's going to be, IT spending will be down compared to the previous year. IT spending is not negative, but it is down compared to last year. And most of that, or not most of that, all of that is due to the hardware market, but we are still seeing software and services growing well. Helping your customers to so one thing is whether your company has transitioned to becoming a digital enterprise, and then the next step is kind of going to your customers and helping them transition to becoming digital enterprises and how they can transform their business. As emerging market region, there's still plenty of room. I mean, I gave you a few examples, for example, of some of these local AR, VR companies, but in most cases, most of those innovation accelerators, whether it's robotics or 3D printing or cognitive, in most cases, it's pretty much a green field in Latin America. And there are a few companies, bigger companies that have come in some cases have first mover advantage, but the market right now is so fragmented and it's so use case specific that it's still really wide open. And ultimately, remember that a lot of those, even though a lot of you might already have companies or operations in the larger markets, don't forget about some of those smaller markets that are growing much faster than the larger markets, and whether you have the channel partners in place to help you capture those potential sales. So IDC Latin America, I should say, now has an app. So we'd love for you to download it. We have it available both for iOS as well as all the Android phones. And we'll be occasionally sending out surveys through this. We'll also be sending market summaries and reports through this. So I'd encourage all of you to download the app. You can look for it in the stores under IDC Quest. And just briefly wanted to discuss a new report series that we have in Latin America. So these are qualitative reports that are published every 6 to 8 weeks with some of the hottest topics that we are seeing in the region. Some of them kind of touched on briefly today, but you could see big data, infrastructure as a service. We talked about industry clouds, mobile applications, as well as cognitive, next generation security, looking at the issue of hybrid clouds, and also what are the top 10 third platform channels that we're seeing in Latin America. So if you're interested in that, Irina will be happy to guide you through it. So thank you so much. I think now I'm going to pass it back to Irina.
Thank you very much, Jay. We will now proceed to the Q&A portion of the webinar. As a reminder, please use the Q&A box to send in your questions and or comments. We will do our best to respond to them. So I'll pass it over to Jay to lead the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Thanks, Irina. So the first question was 96.3 billion. It's asking whether the 96.3 billion that we showed in market growth on Latin, was that the growth or the total addressable market? So the 96 billion is the total addressable market for hardware, software, and services. So the market is growing. It is growing to 96.3 billion. Okay, the next question is, You didn't specifically talk about big data, but is it happening in Latin America? So, yeah, I know that's true. I only briefly mentioned big data in passing, but yes, we are seeing big data implementations happening in Latin America. It's actually a pretty fast-growing market. We're seeing growth every year between 15 and 20% in big data, and it's important. I think a lot of people have, when they think of big data, they generally think of more on the software side, but I mean a lot of that spending is also on the hardware and the services space. So just to put it in perspective, within just the financial category or financial vertical, I believe off the top of my head, but 1.5 or 1.7 billion will be spent on hardware, software, and services this year, just on big data solutions. And we're also seeing that being integrated now with things such as cognitive or artificial intelligence or retail. I remember a data point that in the retail space in Latin America this year, we're expecting about 1.6 billion spent in big data solutions. Let me see if we have time for one more question. Okay, here's one. It says, you mentioned some of the smaller countries in the region are growing faster. Are they adopting some of these leading technology trends as fast as the big countries? So that, it really depends on the countries. And some of the markets, they're just as developed as some of the larger ones, and some of the smaller, poorer ones, they aren't. But, I mean, in some of the cases, we do have connectivity issues. But the positive news is sometimes sometimes even in some of these smaller, poor countries, we kind of see a leapfrogging. So while, you know, cutting the cord or cutting the cable might be something that we're talking about in more mature markets, you know, as people went from, you know, maybe traditional phone to cellular, or maybe from a cable package to, you know, going to over the top. In some of these smaller markets or poorer markets in some cases, we see the vendors, or not the vendors, the customers or the clients or the households going, you know, basically cutting the cord from the beginning. So going straight from not having any connectivity in their house for phones straight to a mobile phone, or maybe, you know, never having a paid cable subscription to just going straight to over the top once they get internet connectivity. So we do see opportunities in those markets. But yeah, generally those countries are slower to adopt some of these, but we do see leapfrogging. And now with the advent of cloud software, I mean, many of these companies in these countries can access, you know, cloud software solutions just as easily as anybody else. Okay, Liz is telling me we have time for one more question. So it says, you said hardware is negative. What can distributors and resellers do? So that's a great question. So what we're seeing is that definitely the distribution landscape for the region has changed drastically. Or I mean, the distribution landscape has been changing for years. In Latin, you know, we could say every 10 to 15 years we kind of see a massive change in how it goes about business, and part of this is from, you know, the first platform to the second platform, to the third platform. But over the last, I'd say, 3 years, we've seen an even more dramatic change where we've seen some of the companies going out of business. We've seen some of them being bought up by larger ones, and we've also seen some of them focus in different areas. So what we're seeing is the ones that are still focusing on the hardware space, which, as you can see, the margins on the hardware were relatively lower than some of those other areas. We've been seeing them become bigger and bigger. So essentially, you know, buying up their competitors or taking advantage of competitors that are doing poorly and being able to absorb them and their customer portfolio, and essentially being able to buy more, you know, greater volumes, get greater discounts, et cetera. And then we've seen some partners shift where maybe traditionally they were just in the more box-moving hardware space and kind of becoming more of a value-add distributor. Nowadays, it's kind of turned into a buzzword where everybody wants to call themselves a value-add distributor, but we really have seen some, especially focusing on enterprise networking area where, in many cases, they don't have any of the traditional mainline products, and they're really focusing on advanced solutions with their customers. So we've kind of seen a split of the vendors going both ways. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Rena.
Thank you, Jay, again. Our goal is, of course, to answer all of your questions. However, due to time restraints, the remaining questions that are in the queue will be answered via email. Please be reminded that in the next several days, you will be receiving an audio replay link of today's webinar. Thank you again to Jay Gambina for his very insightful presentation, and thank you to all of you on the line who joined today's webinar. This concludes today's session. Thank you again, and we all hope you have a great day.